Good evening again, and a special welcome to Michael Caplan, our documentary filmmaker, who's here to talk about his film Stones from the Soil, which is about his father's experience at a Jewish collective farm in Germany, not in a kibbutz, not in Argentina or one of these colonies, but actually in Germany in the 1930s. It's really an interesting story. It's a fascinating episode that I had never heard of in my studies of the Holocaust and the German Jewish experience. And so I'm thrilled that Michael was willing to join us and to talk about his film. I thought, just for opening, I'll give you a quick summary of the film in case people haven't seen it. It is available on Vimeo. And we'll ask Michael, would it be okay if we put the link to the Vimeo video in the YouTube description?
Absolutely.
So we'll make sure it's available for people to see. If they find this interesting and want to check out the full documentary in the future, that'll be available too. So the summary of the story is that in 1930s Germany, obviously, Jews were being oppressed socially before the Nazis came to power, and then legally after Hitler was recognized as chancellor in early 1933. And the question was, what's the future of Jewish life in Germany? Some thought that the answer was to leave. And immigrants started leaving as early as that period and all the way through the beginning of the Second World War, and even after that point. Some thought it was to go to Israel and to be pioneers in a Jewish state. If in Germany they couldn't make it, maybe no non-Jewish country would be the place for them. But some decided to double down on their German Jewishness as a unique synthesis, as a particular culture that had evolved over the last couple hundred of years. And they thought that the way to do this would be to create this farm, to bring youth on that farm, and to teach them how to be productive members of society in the manual trades, in things like carpentry and shoeing horses as a blacksmith and plowing fields and learning how to plant, to be farmers and to feel connected to the land. And the hope was that they would either go off to seed colonies of this German Jewishness connected to the land somewhere else in the world, or maybe even convince the Germans themselves that they had made a great mistake and to change the direction of society. In the end, of course, we, living on the other side of the Holocaust, know how the story ends. Ultimately, the collective farm at Gross Breesen was attacked by the SS. The men and boys there were sent to Buchenwald for a short period and then told, get out of the country. And so they did manage to leave. So it's not a happy ending, although part of what makes the documentary meaningful is that Michael himself is a child of one of these people who was at Gross Breesen, and he's part of a whole community of people who have connections to that story. And he was able to take footage of reunions that these alumni had and to interview them about their experiences there. And it really was a unique place with a unique ideology behind it. So with that overview and introduction, I wanted to turn to Michael to offer any opening thoughts that he has, and also maybe to start the conversation by telling us what moved you to make this documentary.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Thanks for meeting via what has become all too common for us, via Zoom. But on a snowy day like tonight, this is a good way, I think, to meet. So I'm really glad to be here. So I grew up with, my father was a refugee, a Holocaust survivor. But I think, like most people, when you're younger, you don't really question what it is that your parents have gone through. It's just the norm. Like the fact that I didn't know my dad had a German accent until I had a friend in high school who pointed that out to me. So what motivated me to do it was my father passing in 1996. And so it was pretty soon after thinking about him and reflecting on him and his life that I realized that this was an amazing story of what he had gone through, and that it really struck me as someone who had grown up with stories of the Holocaust, that this was a story of survival. This was a story of a positive actions that had been taken by the Jewish community in Germany that was looking ahead and was not, they were not victims. So that felt like a really rare story to tell, and that I had a unique perspective as, you know, as the son of someone who had been at Gross Breesen to tell that story. So I reached out to one of the people that I had known growing up, one of the families that my dad had stayed close to, a man named George Londecker, who had a farm in upstate New York. And gosh, I think I probably wrote him a letter, because this would have been in 99 or so. 97, 98, no, it was 98, I think. And he wrote back and said, we're having a reunion, you should come. And that really started everything. So I went up to this reunion up in the Catskills and met a lot of people that I had never met before. And it was almost like walking into a family reunion. So that's really what started it. But I can expand on that, you know, as we go along. But why don't we take a look at the trailer that I cut together, which kind of tells a little bit about the story for those of you who haven't seen it yet.
Okay, so I'm going to play the video of the trailer.
Sometimes one is driven to find a place because of the meaning it has beyond the actual physical walls.
It was an island to us.
We'll start fresh tomorrow.
Life was tough there, and the toughness was enjoyable. And I think it has helped me during my whole life.
Michael, one of the things that struck me about the film was it's not a podcast, you know, it's not a radio story.
No.
So the choice of images is really, you know, important and defining. And you definitely included a lot of trains in your documentary choices. Talk to us a little bit about why you thought that would be a useful image to include in this particular story.
Well, kind of, again, going back a little bit to having grown up and seen a lot of Holocaust related documentaries, I felt like there were images that were all too familiar to people, like Hitler, like the SS, like concentration camps. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do something that was a little bit more about, again, the positive experience of what these young people had gone through. That said, when I was in Europe shooting a lot of this footage, the trains were just something that just, you know, jumped out at me. And obviously it's a very powerful image for those of us who know what happened during the Holocaust. And so it was a way to me of incorporating some of that, a little bit of that darkness, you know, without directly showing some of the more kind of brutal images that we're all too familiar with. But, you know, there was, you know, trains were also a way of escape for people. So it also had a feeling of freedom to me, you know, that this was something that people could take a train out of Germany, you know, so I felt like it was something that just felt appropriate. But that's why you won't see any pictures, you know, in the movie of the Nazis, of Hitler, or any of those things, because I felt like it just would look like another documentary that we're all too familiar with, and I wanted this story to stand out as something different.
I thought what was interesting about using trains is that it's a kind of visual vocabulary. You know, it's a shorthand for deportation, for, you know, the cattle cars and whatever, but you don't have to be that explicit about it. It's almost like you're talking to an audience that knows what you're referring to. And I felt the same way about your use of the sort of still photos of Winter Hill in a farm with barbed wire up close, when you're describing some of the increasing persecution of the Jews under the Nazi regime. Again, you don't have to do more than show a little bit of barbed wire and snow and have some words flashing on the screen, and that's enough to evoke the atmosphere without having to get as explicit about it. I thought that was very well done.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. One of the hardest things about telling any kind of historical story is trying to judge what your audience knows and doesn't know and what they've seen and haven't seen. So I try and kind of aim for the middle, where I'm assuming that people have some awareness of the historical setting. But I also didn't want to leave the chance that there were certain things that people didn't know. So there were times when I included a year-by-year countdown of what is happening in Germany just for about 30 or 40 seconds so that people say, oh yeah, okay. And even people who know a lot about what happened in Germany during that time don't know exactly how the progression happened, that it was gradual, that it was year by year, something more would happen. And it would be just enough that the Jewish community would say, okay, we can take this, this will blow over. And, of course it didn't.
That's a question that came to mind thinking about this program tonight. It's not fair to judge in hindsight, to look back and say, oh, well, they should have known this. That's not how life was lived. I mean, we're living right now in the aftermath of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And there are plenty of people out there on TV saying, well, we should have known. But you don't live life that way.
Right.
So we're not going to judge them. But in retrospect, sort of in the big picture, looking back, was a step like Gross Breesen a mistake? Doubling down on this German Jewish identity versus leaving it behind. There's a description of the German Jewish experience as a one-sided love affair, where the Jews fell in love with German culture, but it didn't love them back. And there's a very poignant short story by Bernard Malamud called "The German Refugee," about a professor who has to give a lecture in English. And he has a student who's supposed to help him translate his notes from German into English. But one of the barriers to get it done is that he refuses to speak any German because he's so mad at this country that has rejected him and pushed him away that he has no home anymore. He's lost who he is because what he loved and invested himself in so much has rejected him. So I'm curious for your thought about that synthesis of Germanness and Jewish culture, maybe even your father's experience and yours growing up. How much was German? How much was German Jewish? How much was Jewish, et cetera?
Well, I want to be clear because I feel like you kind of just slightly are misinterpreting maybe what the goals of Gross Breesen were, which was it was always about giving the teenagers, the youth, a chance to get out of Germany and go somewhere and start a farm. Mm-hmm. So the goal in most of the adults' minds was, let's see how this goes. This may blow over, but the teenagers didn't have a choice. They couldn't go to school. They couldn't learn a trade. So it was really about getting them out of Germany, not to escape per se, but to be able to start their lives. Mm-hmm. So you're right in that the adults felt like, we can wait this out. But the farm itself was about kind of like, splitting the difference, saying, let them learn these manual trades, let them go somewhere together was the original thought, like Argentina, like Brazil, not Israel, not Palestine at that point. And they can then start their lives.
Maybe I'm misremembering, but I thought that the part of the focus of the school was on German culture also, that they wanted to be true to Judaism and connected to German culture.
It was, and there was an embracing of German Jewish culture for sure. And there was certainly a valuing of that. but it wasn't about staying in Germany. It was about finding a way to survive and thrive. What is, I think, unique about the German Jewish population is they were not as inclined to be Zionists. They did not want to go to Israel because they didn't see themselves as Zionists. They saw themselves as German Jews, and so there was, most people who emigrated out of Germany did not go to Palestine. They went elsewhere. The people in Gross Breesen went everywhere, from Argentina to Australia, to the US. So, but yeah, there was definitely a valuing of German culture. It's just that, as you said, Germany did not love them back.
What did you find was maybe the most moving, or some of the most moving discoveries that you made in creating the film?
Wow. There were so many, because, just starting with the fact that all these people who were, already in their 70s and 80s when I met them, they were all teenagers when all of this happened. And I had a younger child at that point. I think it was about 4 or 5. And I became very aware of just how vulnerable and how open they were to whatever was next, and that they had to trust, what their parents were telling them was the right thing to do. But also what struck me is that they had a really good time while they were there most of the time. And so and there's this other side to it, is that they weren't hiding in plain sight. They weren't hiding, they were just there. But it was almost like most people around them, the German population, didn't really pay that much attention to them. So they really kind of had this unique experience of being kind of, 150 special teenagers who were able to have this very unique experience. And that was one of the things that really struck me, that they could hang out and just enjoy their time there, even though they were working hard. There was also an element of, they were away from their families. They were away from the cities where things were starting to ramp up. So it's like they were almost had a kind of a secluded existence for several years, which was really touching, because, that they got something that not a lot of people got to experience at that point.
I jotted in my notes, it was like living in a bubble. They could have
It
their own
was,
experience.
it was, even though there were local townspeople who came in and worked at Gross Breesen, and some of them trained them in certain farming aspects and some of the manual trades. And so people knew they were there, but it was just like they had their own little bubble. Yeah.
So maybe we'll play a second clip we have, which is about Kurt Bondi, and who was the sort of pedagogical inspiration for the school. Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit more about the ideology behind it.
In learning to cope with the situation, it takes always 2 things, or 3. It takes the situation itself, it takes your own thinking and will, and if you're lucky, it takes some leadership that shows you which way you can go.
Right. Well, he was just unique. He was just unique. There wouldn't have been any Breesen without Bondi. There's not the slightest doubt about it.
Kurt Bondi was a revolutionary psychologist. It was Martin Buber, the esteemed German Jewish philosopher, who suggested that Bondi run Gross Breesen. Kurt Bondi believed that he could mold these teenagers, who were away from their parents, away from the cities, and away from the anti-Semitism, into self-sufficient, self-aware, and proud German Jews. He wanted these young German Jews to become physically strong, people who could work the land, and who were educated, a thoroughly modern people. The German Jewish community, under the leadership of the famous Berlin rabbi Leo Beck, sponsored Gross Breesen. Their hope was to train and educate these teenagers to start new communities of German Jews in exile.
He founded that school on three principles. One, to remain true to our Jewish religion. Second, to maintain our German cultural background. And third, to become efficient and effective farmers.
What I knew was that it was a school to train young men and women who had to get out of Germany for agricultural work overseas.
Somehow we were contacted that Gross Breesen was being established, and I got interested with your father. We both applied together.
So that gives you a little flavor of the school, that emphasis on working and on becoming productive farmers. There is a quirk in Jewish history in this time period where everybody wants to make the Jews into something they're not.
Right.
Which is farmers.
Right.
The Jews have been city people going back 2,000 years. And they've been very successful in business and handicrafts, but they haven't been farmers. They weren't allowed to own land in Europe. And, honestly, being a peasant isn't a particularly attractive professional choice in the modern era when you have other options. But Zionists, Jewish socialists,
right,
Jewish communists, this Gross Breesen community, everyone's saying, Jews, go work with your hands, do real work. And try, save yourself from your urbanness. And half the people who wind up, going out to Birobidzhan, which is a Soviet Jewish paradise in Siberia, wind up in cities doing city stuff because that's what Jews do.
It's how I start the movie. As I say, did you hear the one about the Jewish farmer? It's like it's a joke almost, but. Actually, George, who you just saw in the film, he did become a farmer. He went to upstate New York and started a dairy farm, and there were a few people like that. But you're right; it's funny. I just finished reading Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, and he talks about how successful Jews have been in the U.S. because, unlike other immigrants, like the people from Ireland or from Germany, they didn't come here and just had no skills. And so they became, like you said, farmers, peasants, and they didn't have those trained skills, whereas the Jews had business skills. So
literacy was a big advantage too.
Oh yeah, for sure. But nonetheless, that's why, that it was different, but it made sense because they couldn't learn anything else while they were in Germany.
Right.
So this made sense, and Bondi was really unique because he didn't know farming, but he could hire people who would train them. But his job was to run the whole camp so that everything was structured. One of the things I did not include in the movie, which I just loved, was during every night they would sit around. It felt very 60s to me. They would sit around and he would say, so today I saw this happen. People were fooling around, they weren't paying attention. What do you think about that? And he would make these 16-year-olds reflect on what it is that they did that day, and they'd have to sit there and say, oh, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't have done that, or maybe next time I could learn something. It was very, very modern. And then they would put on plays at night, and they would have classical music. So it was really, it was modern. But yeah, I see actually that in that little segment, they talked about venerating the German culture. So yeah, there was never a rejection of Germany. It was more this is something where it's happening now. We have to get through it, and these are the ways that we can do it.
Yeah. One of the phrases that was attributed to Bondi in the film, and in part we're not going to see, is the phrase "live consciously."
Yeah.
Be aware of what you're doing, make choices, have a direction. And other people cited that as something that was meaningful for them in their lives going forward, even after they left the school.
Yeah, and as someone now who, I'm a college professor, so I'm always having to tell my students to live consciously and to start to self-reflect, and that's painful, especially if you're a teenager or a college student. So it was transformative for them to have that experience.
Yeah. One of the challenges in these kind of projects is sometimes you have trouble finding what you're looking for. So you describe in the film how you found the wrong castle. It's in the wrong country now because all the borders changed.
Right.
And eventually you found the right place.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, were there questions or issues that you never really got answered, or that you weren't able to shed light on, that you had wanted to find out and you just have to live without?
There were, part of it is just, people's memory, and I can appreciate that more now, 20 years since I made this film, trying to remember, what happened. So that was always kind of an issue. Part of it, there was, like, I asked them, like, were there relationships, were there boyfriends and girlfriends, and people were kind of a little bit, demure about that. They didn't really want to talk about that, or a few people would say, oh yeah, but I can't really talk about it, I also had a strange experience, which I've since heard from other documentary people that this is not uncommon, is that a gentleman showed up at this first reunion that I went to. I went to about 3 of them, but the one where I made all the initial interviews were the first one I went to, who had heard about it and nobody knew who he was. And he said that he had been at Gross Breesen and he was the right age and nobody remembered him. And I interviewed him, and the experience that he told me didn't sound like anybody else's. And you just think that, why would someone come to a reunion in the Catskills when they weren't there? And I was never able to resolve that, but I did not include him in because everyone told me, everyone who was there said, no, he wasn't there. And I just thought that is so strange. But since then, I've heard, and actually there have been documentaries about people who have spent their life telling people that they had X experience, and then it was later found out that they didn't.
There was a famous episode, maybe 20 years ago now. A man named Benjamin Wilkomirski wrote a Holocaust memoir called Fragments. Describing his experience as a child in this concentration camp, and it's all made up. It was like a bombshell when it came out that in fact he had lived in Switzerland the whole time and he had never been in a camp. And but the story is a very moving story. It was
made up
story and not history. It's not real. So Laurie has a question, and I warn you, he's a professional historian, so he'll have a good.
Yeah, that's okay. And I'm a little hoarse because I've got the COVID problem. So
okay.
No, actually, I had a couple of 2 things, but the first thing I wanted to say was that that's actually not very unusual. There's something called stolen valor, and it's quite usual that people claim that they were in the military, earned a certain medal, and they were never in the military. A certain congressman from North Carolina comes to mind, but I mean, it's not. But for many of these people, it's not really a lie. They've really convinced themselves that they were involved in these sorts of things. People also, like Rabbi said, they remember bits and pieces from something they read or heard, and they incorporate it into their own memories, and they create this sort of story for themselves. My background is actually, I'm an African historian and did a lot of oral history. And oral history is a very dangerous thing because people tend to change how they remember things, or remember things they want to remember and disregard the things that were not very pleasant. And it's just the nature of human minds. I mean, you know, people who are 50 or 60 years removed from things, and they're talking about, well, yes, I was in the Battle of Shiloh, you know, and they're talking about the stuff that actually didn't happen to the unit they were involved with, but you know, that kind of thing. So it's not at all unusual, and it's something that you, in the business, we always correlate. And if we can't correlate, we're very careful to say that we didn't correlate this. So this gentleman, you couldn't correlate it, so you didn't include him, and I think that's absolutely sound historical practice. You know, as far as
absolutely. Well, and for most of them, I had pictures in this album.
Also true.
Where I could actually see, you know, oh, there's this person, you know, but he did not show up. So, you know, but there was also this weird talk about like history getting reinterpreted is for all of the people who lived in that area now, which is Poland, there were stories that had been passed around that there was some Jewish group there, but that they had escaped through tunnels. And it was this whole elaborate thing that had not happened at all, but it was just, you know, it was passed on second degree because now it's not even the same country, you know, so everyone who lived around there had, you know, either died in the war or who had been pushed out at the end of the war. So yeah, it is strange. There's actually an entire documentary, I think, on Netflix called Raised by Wolves.
Yeah.
That's about a woman who claimed that she had been raised by wolves in the forest of, I think it was Russia. And again, it's just like, no, of course she wasn't raised by wolves, but she spent 30 years going around talking about her experiences and wrote a book.
And probably took it from Mussorgsky. So I had a couple of very picky sort of just questions that would come to my mind. Who owned the chateau?
Okay. So that's a good question. So it was an old castle, and it was, I don't know who owned it, but I know it was bought by this Jewish organization who was the one who had put the whole thing together. So they were the ones who really sponsored it. Like I mentioned in that little clip there, Leo Beck was this really esteemed rabbi who organized a lot of these things, and they were the ones who said we need to find a place where we can train all these kids. And like I said, there were about 150 there. So I don't know who actually owned it originally, but it was bought by the Jewish organization, the Reformed Jewish organization in Germany.
Well, that's kind of what I wanted to know, because I was curious if it was a pre-existing Jewish, you know, someone owned it already who was Jewish, or if they had went out and bought it, which is
no.
Fine. Yeah, okay, that makes good sense. And the other question is, I didn't quite from the documentary get what happened to Bondi. I mean, he got out apparently, but what happened to him?
Good question. Bondi went to England during the war, and then later came back to Germany, where he taught in the university for the rest of his life. But there's an interesting little side note, because Bondi had a brother or sister, and now I'm forgetting. I think it was his sister who came to the US, and with her husband, they established this kind of very progressive camp for kids, which ran, I think in Maryland, it was in New England, for a number of years, and it sounded a lot like Gross Breesen. So it was something that continued that kind of more kind of progressive thought of how do you raise teenagers who are without their family, you know?
And one other, if you don't mind, a little personal question, but I'm quite familiar with the difficulty that Jews had getting into the United States in the late 1930s. So especially Congress refused to pass a law allowing all the children in, you know, the St. Louis and all that. Normally you need a sponsor. Did your father have a sponsor?
Yeah, and that was another kind of like 10-minute segment, which I considered putting in and did not put in. So there was a group of about 25 or 30 of the Gross Breeseners, including my father, who were sponsored by a man. This was almost like a mini Schindler's List. There was a man who owned a chain of department stores in Virginia, and he bought a farm, and he made them the owners of the farm.
Huh.
So they now were property owners, these 25 kids, and that's how they were able to immigrate.
Fascinating.
So they had property and they had a place to work. So that's how it worked. So, and I've been to that farm with some of the people who were there, and it was the first chicken farm ever established in Virginia. So it was actually a mini kind of proof and concept of what it is that Gross Breesen was supposed to train them, is that these kids came to Virginia and actually worked on a real farm.
Huh.
But then World War II had started, and then all the young men went off to fight. So it kind of ended at that point. But yeah, so that's how they did it. There was a sponsor who made it possible for these 25 teenagers to immigrate.
That's cool. That's a cool story. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
And my recollection is actually that a lot of German Jewish young men serving in the army were very valuable because they were fluent in German, and they, when they got into the occupation of Germany, it became invaluable for interrogating prisoners or talking to local officials or whatever else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I know a fellow who's actually, his father did exactly that. He fled Nazi Germany and then was in the U.S. Army and did all the. They went into they were with the group that liberated one of the concentration camps and did a lot of the interpreting.
Yeah, Judy, please.
Yeah, I have a question, Michael. I can't remember if this was in the documentary. How did the farm? What happened to the farm? I mean, when did it end? Did somebody just come in and tell us everybody war's over, get on with your lives? I mean,
well, there's a couple text, I put it in text near the end, and it's pretty brief, so it would make sense that you wouldn't necessarily remember it. So it's kind of actually tragic. So this first group, and they were really called like in retrospect, they were the first Gross Breesen group. All of them emigrated by 1939, before the war started. But then there was another group that came and were doing the same things. Bondi was already gone, but there was someone else who ran it. And I think only about 10 of them got out. The rest were rounded up in about 1941 or 42 and sent to concentration camps, and that was the end of it. So it was a pretty tragic ending for those people who were trying to do the same thing as the first group.
Yeah, I saw that. But what happened? Did they go back to try to find their families, the ones that survived? Did they get noticed, go somewhere? I mean, how do they notify people what to do when the war ended?
I mean, by that point, well, this was long before the war ended. So it was done. There was nobody there at the farm by the time the war ended. Everyone had been either killed or had emigrated by about 41 or 42.
Oh, so there was a few years left. Okay.
Yeah. The strangeness of showing up in what is now a different country, and this castle having been bought recently when we got there by a young, Poland had already opened up to capitalism. So this was this owner of a chain of drugstores had bought this castle, and he was rehabbing it. And there were so many things, we talk about Beschert, was meant to be. The fact that when we got there, it was just starting to be rehabbed so that we could actually see it the way pretty much it had been. But if we had come 6 months later, it would have been this modern, just kind of a mansion, you know, in this old castle. So we got to actually go there and talk to the architect, who just flipped out, you know, when we were showing him these photos of what it looked like in the 40s and 30s. It was one of those just amazing things that we got there when we did.
Victoria, you hit your hand up before, and then Elliot.
I was thinking first when you said that you hadn't realized that your father had an accent until somebody told you. And I had this experience with a friend whose father was also a Holocaust survivor. At his funeral, this came up, and he was a kid in Poland. He lived on a farm in Poland, and somebody made a reference to your dad's accent. And she said, what are you talking about? Like, this never, you know, because your parents just sound how they sound, and you totally understand them. You wouldn't have, I mean, that's your original people who you've heard speak, so you have no trouble understanding them no matter what. But so I was thinking about that and wondering, so what you heard from your father, have you either in making this or later talked to other people who are your generation, the children of the people who were there, and have you heard similar, you know, things from them if their parents wanted to share or not?
Well, again, there's just a really brief snippet in the movie near the end where it's me sitting with all the second generation of Gross Breeseners who are roughly my age, and the common experience of growing up with parents who had gone to Gross Breesen was overwhelming. Again, it was like, makes me want to go back and start emailing people now, because there was such a similarity of talking about what their parents were like and how they were people who didn't take things for granted, and how they were self-aware, you know. So there was definitely a common experience of the people. You know, people lived in different places, people had different jobs. It wasn't about that. It was just about kind of an attitude towards life. And that was another thing I really wanted to communicate through the movie, was that this was a rare and special experience that they had.
Yeah. Elliot, please.
Two questions. One is, was Bondi Jewish?
Yes, he was.
Okay, and obviously he got out.
Yeah, yeah.
So the question Lynn and I had from the movie was, how did your dad find out about the farm? Did you see a flyer? Was it part of the temple conversation?
That is a good experience. And George refers to it in the clip that they heard about it. I'm thinking it's probably the Jewish youth groups, which were a big, big thing. There were pictures, a lot of pictures in this album of these, you know, these weekends they would have, and, you know, summer camp that they would have. It was really the center, you know, of the youth, the young Jewish experience were these Jewish youth groups. And it especially became important starting in 33 when there were these Nazi youth groups. So it really became, that was really the center of the experience. Now, my father and George lived in Königsberg, which is now Russia, actually, strangely enough.
Kaliningrad is the
Kaliningrad, yeah.
title.
But it's a big city, and it was, you know, so there was, you know, there was the community center, you know, there were places to go, there were gathering places. So I think someone was just going around from this national Reform Jewish group to these various cities and towns, and basically pitching Gross Breesen, come to Gross Breesen. This would be a great place for you to send your kids. And I think that's pretty much how you did it at that point.
And your grandfather, what was his profession?
My grandfather owned a lumber yard in Königsberg. So he was a small businessman.
You know, the experience of Gross Breesen is in some ways a subset of a larger phenomenon in that period of 1933 to 39 among German Jews, where they actually were very creative in response to the persecution they experienced. They were kicked off of newspapers. They started Jewish newspapers. They were kicked out of professions. They started Jewish associations. They were kicked out of German schools. They started Jewish schools. And so it was sort of the paradox. It's almost like I mean, maybe the parallel is too strong. Maybe it's good. The experience of the Negro Leagues in the United States, where they weren't allowed to play in the mainstream leagues, but they created their own product and experience. And there's something sad about the end of that, because once you get Jackie Robinson in the major leagues, now the Negro League support falls down. And actually it's worse for black ball players because there are a lot fewer jobs than when they had their own leagues. And so for the Jews in Germany, this window of time where people actually reconnected. You mentioned, I think your grandparents were Jewish twice a year, or they were very disconnected.
They were reformed. They were Reformed Jews, right? They saw themselves as German first and Jewish
but
second.
Not even like going to temple Reformed Jews. They were not going to temple Reformed Jews. But something pushed them out of that persecution experience to reconnect in sending their son off to go to this Jewish camp and to investigate and reconnect with his Jewish peers. So there was that sort of paradox of, you don't want persecution, obviously, but sometimes it produces community feeling and creativity.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it really, again, it stayed with all of them for the rest of their life. So it was transformative. Yeah, absolutely.
Any other comments or questions for Michael?
Well, can we look at that last clip?
Yeah, I was going to say we have one more clip to play, and we
yeah.
can use that to wrap up or start to wrap up.
When I left Gross Breesen, I was ready to face anything. You know, the inner strength we got there, it's impossible to understand what it did to us. Life was tough there, and the toughness was enjoyable. And I think it has helped me during my whole life.
They got the idea of life is important, not life is beautiful. Life is important.
Yeah, that's one of the big ones. Ernst Kramer, I get a little emotional talking about Ernst Kramer. He's the guy that you see me talking to in that one clip. And he was also a friend of my father's, and he was one of the few German Jews who went back to Germany, and he lived in Berlin. He worked for Axel Springer Verlag, the biggest publisher in Germany. And so I saw him there when he was in his 80s. Then I went back with my family in 2014, and he was 95 at that point and still going to work every day. He died 6 months after we visited in 96. But Ernst was a little bit older than everybody else, and he was Bondi's assistant. And boy, he had the wisdom. He took what Gross Breesen gave him, and he just ran with it like few of them did. And that just hits me when he talks about that life is important. It's not beautiful, which is, you know, you like to say, oh, life is beautiful, you have to treasure it. His thing is, yeah, sometimes it's beautiful, sometimes it's horrible, but it's important. And that to me feels like a real Jewish kind of, you know, way of looking at it, that you got to be practical about it. It's not always, you know, roses and sunshine, but, you know, you bring what you've got to it and make it work. And like you heard, he wasn't the only one who came out of Gross Breesen feeling that way. So in that sense, even though, you know, Gross Breesen was not, you know, Zionistic about like, oh, we're all Jews. It was, yes, we're Jews, and this is a Jewish way to live life, which is to, you know, kind of take it on and take it seriously.
Great. Well, I found the documentary to be very moving. I hope that people who haven't seen it, who are watching this video in the future, will have a chance to watch it and experience the story. There's a very sort of sad and yet hopeful postscript to it, where near the end, Michael points out that he has the ticket his father used to get from Hamburg to the United States, and the date on it is August 10th of 1939, which is just 3 weeks before the war begins with the German invasion of Poland. And it's one of those, by the skin of your teeth, by the hair on your chin to get through. But then it does give you that message of not only to remember what happened, but also to make the most of what you can in your new life that you have the chance to experience. Yeah. So again, I want to thank Michael for his wonderful documentary and also for being willing to join us and to talk about it. Thanks all of you for being here. Any last comments or thoughts or questions by anyone or by Michael?
Well, I just want to say this was the first documentary I made, and I was 40 when I made it. And I was really fortunate because I got it on national PBS in 2003, 2004. And it was an amazing experience to share this story. But about 2-3 years ago, I decided I just wanted to, we're in the internet age. I decided I just wanted it to be out there and to be free. So I put it up on Vimeo and YouTube. So it's available for free for anybody to watch, because I just felt like there was no point in asking people to rent it for, $3 a piece. That just felt like that was not why I made it in the first place. So please spread the word, I guess is what I'm saying. If you want people to see an experience of a different view of the German Jewish experience during that time, that's a little bit more positive and upbeat.